Welcome to the 24th Annual Capital Conference, Virtual Edition. It is our goal that each session is about an hour in length. However, we may go a little longer or maybe shorter. My name is David Stevens, and I'm the Director of Academic Activities for UIL. Also helping with this session is Glenda Munoz, Administrative Assistant for UIL Academics. This session is the Introduction to the Social Studies Contest. Our presenter is Andy Bates, the Social Studies State Contest Director. Andy, it's not the introduction, it is social studies like in-depth discussion.
Next level.
In-depth discussion of social studies. Sorry about that. Andy, thank you for being willing to share your wisdom and knowledge with our attendees in this new format of Capital Conference.
Always a pleasure. So let's get going. As you see, we are in depth. Got 70 people already, so that's great. As David just mentioned, I'd love to have some questions. There's just so much I want to tell everybody about this topic and just how it came to be and what it's meant to be. And that just seems to be something that lends itself to in person, but we can't do that. So we're going to try and still reach out and try to get those ideas and those connections between me and you happening regardless. So we're going to, I think we're going to share a lot of information here, but the best way to do that is for you to share some thoughts as well, or questions really, as I start to explain things so that I can further clarify while you have me directly. Okay, don't forget, next Friday, I'll be back. I'll be with the good doctor, Bradley Wilson, discussing current events and social studies essays, how to make those pop, how to make them best, what the best practices are, discussing our thoughts behind them, not just how to write them, but how to grade them, what to put out there when you're at your district to make sure that they are handled in the best way possible. So that'll be next Friday.
Andy, that's going to be next Thursday, the 25th at 11 a.m.
That's what I said. I don't know if you heard. I said Thursday. Someone wrote Friday on this presentation, but it's actually Thursday. So that's when I'll see you, is with that. All right. So moving on. You have not died of dysentery, as the screen says, but I thought while I was looking through things, the Oregon Trail reference has come up a lot in what I've been looking at, and hopefully you won't die on your way through this, but let's get going. I'll try to stop for water and for medical supplies if anyone needs it. All right, so what I'm going to be doing, section 1, type of questions that you'll see there. There will be some overlap from the previous session I did earlier in the week. Not a lot, but there will be some. So if you're new and you didn't get that one, that's okay. I am going to cover some of the things I mentioned there. If you were there before, the repeats will be minimum, but I'll use them more to build off of stuff. Like I said, I want you to kind of see behind the curtain into what passes for my brain and why I picked this topic, why I made this topic what it was, so that hopefully you have a better idea of how to approach this topic and teach this topic to your teams and to your students. So section 1, like I said, we'll talk about the terms, the types of questions there. Section 2, types of questions you'll see there and how they might be a little different and the different areas of focus for the book. In section 3, how the type of questions will differ there. Look at the resources just a little bit with the time that we have and the areas that I'm going to focus on within those resources for questions. Essay areas, talked about that a little bit in the first section for beginners. So I'll do that again, but more in depth. Definitely going to talk about strategies, how best to study all of this information that we're throwing out there, at least in my opinion, and some resources to help you do that. And like I said, hopefully we can get some questions going so that I get as much pertinent information out there as possible, and it's not just me talking about things I like to talk about, which it will be.
I'm going to interrupt you again because I had it wrong on my calendar. I looked at the schedule after everyone clarified in the chat box. It is Friday at 11 a.m. So you're correct.
You
I'm
know, I
wrong.
wanted to say that, but I didn't want to call you out in front of everybody. I mean, we got a big crowd on here. I thought that would be embarrassing for you to be wrong like that, but I'm glad that you were able to give us the correct information, which
Friday.
I
It's
had
Friday.
originally, but all right, so that's good. I do look forward to seeing as many people as possible there, including Dr. Wilson. All right, so what are we talking about here? Obviously, I went over a little bit of the outline, but what is social studies? It's almost been around for 20 years. It's crazy. In a couple years, it'll be old enough to drink. So, I mean, that's a long time to have a contest going. And I think we've been evolving since the beginning and hopefully making it better. But I think it's already great. And so we just make tweaks as we go. And I'll talk about those a little bit as we go through this presentation as well. So follow along, take notes, ask questions. It's being recorded, so you'll be able to refer back to it. And I'll be able to share this later as well, just the PowerPoint. Which gives you a good bit of information. Obviously, you don't get to see and hear me, which, tragedy as that is, it will give you a lot of information just with the PowerPoint. So I'll try to put that up as well. I'll tweet out when that is ready. Mr. Academics is my Twitter handle, so please hit that up. I do polls, I do clarifications, I do questions. So it's a good place to find information. But you can also email me directly if you have a question, and I will very much try to get back there. Again, I had put this in before, but I wanted to see, like, show of hands, how many newbies, but I can't see you all. I can see like 2 of you right now. But if I'm going too fast, or if you need a clarification, if you need me to slow down, please put that in the chat, and I'll try to pump the brakes or go back over something so that I can spend a little more time and clarify it. Because even though it's recorded, I understand that just watching it again or reading it again may not answer your questions. So feel free to let me know. All right, so the contest, as I talked about in the previous session, we go back and forth, domestic topics versus foreign topics. Each year we alternate. So this year is domestic. We are talking about the US, although with most US history, it is going to deal with some aspects of international relations and international history as well. And this one certainly does that. What about other topics? This is one of the times I like to let people know that I am always interested in hearing ideas for other topics. Obviously, we only have one a year. So chances are, even though you told me a topic, and even though it's a great idea, we may not get to use it, or it may be a few years before we do, but I do very much welcome input on topics. They could be outside the box. I've talked before how I've looked at a music topic in the future, perhaps a sports related topic, something as specific as the Olympics, or something more in general. With music, it could be very general, or it could be something specific, the British invasion, whatever it may be. So outside the box is something to definitely throw at me. Don't feel confined by what we've done before. But at the same time, if you're using that as a guideline as well, and just trying to find an area that matches up with what we've talked about before, but is new, is novel, but fits into the same kind of confines of how we've approached topics, that's a good idea too. So send them all my way. I'd love to see some come out on Twitter, and then start a discussion with people going back and forth, because that's a great way for you to do my job for me. But it's actually a great way to just get ideas going instead of just the rump topic discussion, but actually how we would address that topic. Primary selections is probably the biggest obstacle. The reading sources, the book for each year, is the biggest obstacle to making a topic happen. It is surprisingly difficult to find a book that really works with a topic for our particular concepts. because you want it to be, above repute. You don't want it to be just something that anybody put out. You want to make sure that it's academic, it's fact checked, and it's something that we don't have to worry about what we're reading is two biased one way or another. But at the same time, you don't want it to be dry. You don't want it to be just, wandering through the Sahara version of a book for our students. So we have to find it something that's approachable, something that, will bring in a lot of people to read it and be excited about it and not just see it as a chore to read. You want them to enjoy learning about the topic as they read it. So that's not easy in my experience to find. So if you have an idea for a topic, that's great. If you have an idea for a topic and a book that goes with it, that's even better. Okay. So be heard, throw the ideas out there. I'd love to get things going, like I said, start a movement about a particular topic or a particular book. I have done some polls on Twitter in the past, like for next year. I put a bunch of ideas out there a few months back, and French Revolution was something that a lot of people seem to be excited about. And that certainly is something I could go for as a possible foreign topic, maybe even next year. At this time, I don't have anything because I'm kind of in the throes of finalizing everything about this year, but it will be very soon that I start trying to come up with next year's topic. And I'm already thinking about it. I just haven't landed anywhere. So if you have an idea, throw it out there. I would love to hear about it. Balance of difficulty on the test. So we're talking about the test schematics. How do I build a test? The district test, set A test, the state test. I try to make the difficulty level from set A to state, as far as the objective portion goes, the same. I try to balance that out. That is not always the easiest thing to do in the world. Even if I'm very much aware and cognizant of that and I'm comparing questions, it still becomes more difficult, mainly because as I write more questions, the answers start to seem obvious to me. So as I look at the term or the document or the book, and I've been doing this for months and months, writing questions on it, then by the time I get to state, I'm like, well, I can't ask that because that's easy. Everybody knows that. When in reality, not everyone knows that. So I try to keep it about the same, but I do think it tends to get more difficult by the time the state questions are written, just because some of the easier stuff is just done with already. Why do I try to keep it the same? It's basically because I want you to have a good idea of where you're at when you take that set A test. When you take set B, if you get a higher score, that means you know more. Not that the test was easier or the test was harder, but that you learn more. So I want you to use those and be able to compare apples to apples, so to speak. So that's why I do that, and try to keep the rigor the same in the objective section, right? All the way from set A through district on to state. The essays, I do not. The essays actually try to make more difficult, because to me, the whole point of the essay is to see, who's the top of the top, who separate the best from the very best. And that's what the essay in my mind helps do. So I want it to be more challenging by the time you get to state, if you're able to get there. Also, I just think it's a lot to expect in January if someone's taking a set A test to be able to write a really, really developed essay on a topic that's very particular and very limited. Not that I ever want to make the essay too particular or too limited, but I just think when you're starting out, the essay should be more approachable at the beginning at set A and for set B, and then start to ramp up for district, making it more difficult, region, and then state being the pinnacle of, you really have to know what you're talking about to make a solid essay out of this particular question. So I do try to make that harder. What I'm doing now is just the final bit of review I always call it lensing the topic, like trying to see the exact focus of it. I feel like I'm there, but as I go through some things, as I look at terms or people, again, I may say, you know what, there's not enough information there. I want to take that out, or I really overlooked this person or this event. How could I do that? I need to add them. And 99.9% of them are going to stay the same, but there are a few that could change. And so August 1st, I like to say, is when it's set in wet cement, because there could be some changes after August 1st, but those would be corrections, not changes so much as, yeah, I misspelled this person's name, or I made some other mistake as to a year or a name that's in it. So there wouldn't be so much changes as there would be corrections. As I referred to a few corrections that I already know about in the last session. Hastings, the first name for Hastings is not Leonard, it's Langsford. So that's not a change, but a correction. Ira Allen is one that I'm going to change. I'm going to take Ira Allen off, but I am going to add the Vermont Republic as a term. So it's kind of a one-for-one. There are a couple terms that I'm looking at. Perhaps Sam Houston, settler colonialism is another term. Based on just discussions I've had with some of the authors of the books, some of the professors that have written some of the source material that I'm working out of, getting their opinions, have formulated what I'm looking to do. But again, it'll be very minor, one or two changes at the most. Another correction I mentioned is not really a correction because this is the way it's listed, but the McKinley expansionism piece that's in section 3, it's listed in 1903, which is when the interview ran in the source, which I believe is like Atlantic Monthly, from the YOP site, the American YOP Reader. But that is not when he said it, because at least that I know of, unless he's speaking from the grave, because he was dead for a couple years in 1903. If you go to another site that's listed, I forget which one. I think it's U.S. Documents. It has it as 1900, which is when it originally came out. So again, that would be the only kind of changes I'm really looking at, unless it's something that just significantly I overlooked and I need to put it in, or you know what, I'm finding this term is very difficult to find research on, so I'm going to take it out. All right, so what is this topic? Where did I get this topic? How did I get this topic? For one, how cool is this map, right? Like I could stare at this map for just probably hours. Actually, I could do it for more hours is what I could say. I think a lot of people who are into social studies have this attraction to maps. It's probably unhealthy, but I'm just going to feed into that vice with this. I think the best way to encapsulate what this topic is about is if you look at Louisiana right here on this thing, okay, and follow Louisiana, which we all know about the Louisiana Purchase, and we all know about the several flags that have flown over Louisiana and that rich Creole heritage that it has, that mix of cultures. But if you look at how it develops, I don't think a lot of people understand how much of a patchwork it actually was, not in its culture, which gets a lot more attention, but in the actual physical domain that is today Louisiana. It involved treaties, the results of wars, filibustering, and just negotiation and strong arm tactics, as well as removal of people. All those different things that basically that list is what American expansion is or was, are encapsulated just in East Louisiana, really. Not even the whole state, just Eastern Louisiana when you look at that. And so to me, that kind of is a microcosm for this topic. All those different things that created what today we refer to as the United States can be seen right there. And so I wanted to go into that. I wanted to find a topic that shows that thread throughout, that theme, because basically what I did is I pulled a thread. okay, and saw where it would take me. I started with wanting to include a topic that discussed filibusters, because that's just something that's really interesting and always has been to me, because it just seems so odd and out of place. But the more I looked into it, the less odd and out of place it became throughout American history. There's just so many examples of it. And it's really not that different when you look at it, and it's the elements that created these various filibuster movements that happened. It's really not that different from intervention that happened in the 1920s and during McKinley's term, and the expansion that happened, during the New Republic era. There's really a lot of similarities there, from settlers going to Oregon to William Walker going to Nicaragua. They actually aren't that different in some ways. And so from filibusters, I went to imperialism, because I said, okay, well, this is interesting, but I need to expand it. You can't do a whole topic on just filibusters. There aren't that many. And I looked at imperialism, which was also something that, even as a kid, I was really into learning about, mainly because the maps. I think I have an unhealthy attraction to maps, and imperialism, it changed maps dramatically. And kind of like what I referred to before with finding a topic, there aren't as many books about imperialism as you might think. And even the ones that exist, some of them are great, they're very specific, and they didn't quite cover the themes that I wanted to. And so then I expanded to expansion, and I began to see that this really is a thematic topic, that it really does need to be discussed from, early American history to the 20th century to understand the whole process. You can't just look at filibusters or imperialism or expansion or settlers or any one part without all of it, because they really are, one part informs another. The cause and effects are just manifest, no pun intended, so that you have to really look at the whole thing. So how did I do that? And I was going to bring all these books, and then I realized how many books it was, and my back said no. So I didn't carry all these with me, but I put this picture in here so I could kind of go over these books that I have been looking at, that I've read over the last few, moving that out of the way so I can see them, that I've read over the last few weeks and months, so that you can have an idea of what's informing my decisions when I'm creating this topic, and therefore when I create tests. Okay. First off, What God Hath Wrought. This is part of the Oxford American History series, which is a great series if you want to get into it. The only problem with it is it's not done. Even though the series started 40 years ago, they still haven't finished it. But this particular book is done. And even though it's covering a big swath of history, it's able to do it really in depth, but not so much that you get lost in it. I thought it was amazing the way that they were able to give a lot of information, go pretty deep, despite covering so much history. It helps that the book's about 900 pages, so obviously they were able to throw in a lot there. Not 900 pages is pretty much every other book here. Tycoon's War is about Cornelius Vanderbilt versus William Walker, and the events in Nicaragua, Honduras, Costa Rica, and trying to build a canal and trying to create another country, or not necessarily create another country, but create a new regime within an existing country, and tells you a lot just about American politics at the time, support from the public and politicians for these efforts, and how that's waxed and waned depending on what was happening on the ground and also in the world in general. So that's a really good one. Quick read. How to Hide an Empire is great. For a moment, I was thinking about this being the book, but it's too broad, and that's a great part of it, but it covers from the very beginning of the existence of the United States all the way to modern day, talking about not just interventions, but military bases in the United States or throughout the world, the 600-700 bases that we have, and how they continue to influence going so far as to connect the influence of American bases in England and their creation of the Beatles, and bases post-war in Japan and the creation of Sony. So really good stuff there. But like I said, it wasn't quite what I was looking for this topic, but I would very much recommend it for tracing the role of expansion and empire building in the United States. War Lovers is great, and I talked about this on Twitter, so I won't go into it as much, but it's really good looking at specific players during the traditional imperialism era, the end of the 19th century. Manifest Destinies is more about the Mexican-American War and that period of time, and then Oregon and explorations into there in California, obviously. So that's a really good one. Habits of Empire is the one that I would recommend the most because it really does trace this entire topic from literally the roots of the terms within the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and why those original lines were drawn and what they intended to be and what the forces were behind just those first definitions of what is the United States and what is not the United States and the different players involved. And then it goes through all of US history with those same themes. And that's really where you see how these all tie together, how it's really not that different. What happened in Louisiana is just parts of what we saw happen again in California and what we saw in the acquisition of Florida and eventually what we got in Oregon and Alaska, even with the purchase of that. All those elements are at play, but they're all very similar. And when you take those 4 or 5 main elements of expansion, they happen throughout US history. And that's why this topic had to be. For a while, I was thinking, okay, I'll just pick 100 years and that'll be it. That'll be the topic. And it didn't make sense. That was arbitrary. You can't just put those numbers in there because you think it's a good idea and it looks nice or it sounds nice to have a round number when the information doesn't support it. And this book really shows how you can't just force it into this one area, this one decade, even this one century. There's a term, the great American aberration, that imperialism was this finite and very limited amount of time. When in actuality, when you look at it, it wasn't. It was always a part of America was expanding, and its influence expanding, continues even today. So I really like Habits of Empire. I was able to discuss with the author several different ideas about this topic. He's Professor Emeritus of History at Notre Dame. Just chock full of information. Can't rave about it enough. The next one you can see there barely is just an introduction to the West. I like that a lot. I always go into those very short introductions because they're very short. And so you can get through a lot of information very quickly. I used them last year for several of the different elements of the East Asia topic. So the introduction to the West is really good. David McCullough's book, I've only begun that one, so I can't say it's amazing, but I can say his other books are amazing, which I'm sure you know about. Obviously, John Adams and Truman, maybe the most famous, but it discusses the creation and the process behind the Panama Canal. The Spanish-American War Guide there is actually a really good student book I would recommend for breaking things down very simply for that era. And then moving on to In Our Image, that's a Pulitzer Prize winner for talking about the Philippines. And I really liked it, but it was a little too dense for high school. So I thought that wouldn't be a good choice for the book, even though it does what I like, which is to magnify one particular area of the overall topic, in this case, the Philippines and our continued relation with them. Unlike Honor in the Dust, it goes further. It goes all the way post-World War II with the eventual freedom and independence of the Philippines and our continued relation with them after that. And it traces the entire insurgency, war to insurgency to relative peace to back and forth. So it's a good one as well if you really want to get an idea about the Philippines and go even further. And then The Crowded Hour, which is just this phrase that you see pop up again and again, anytime you talk about a lot of these politicians that, and certainly the war hawks in the Spanish-American War era, it's just one of those guiding principles they had about seeking out this crowded hour, this moment of glory in their life, this defining moment. And so this one refers to Roosevelt and his experience with the Rough Riders in Cuba. And if you're really wanting to get some more information about that, that's where that goes. But all of those I recommend, and all of them are definitely going to inform my approach to this topic. All right, so other things that really made me think about this topic, okay? Gold, God, and glory, that's the old tried and true Spanish conquistadors. What were they looking for? Why were they looking for things? And it's something kind of universal in just humankind's desire to find new things, to expand on someone's influence, their power, and what motivates them behind that. Of course, what they say versus what actually motivates them, it's always up for debate, but I think the tried and true of gold, God, and glory really does encompass a lot of not just the European and specifically Spanish conquistadors and their activities, but just expansion in general throughout human history. So this one here, and this is why I really wish people were here to do a little back and forth, but we shall form to the American Union a barrier against the dangerous, I love that when they talk about British province of Canada, dangerous British province of Canada, and add to the empire of liberty an extensive and fertile country. A person who said this seems pretty aggressive. But I've talked to people about this, I bring this up, and they're surprised to know that it's actually Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said this very early on. This was while the war was still going, while we were setting up treaty negotiations for the Treaty of Paris, and what he saw for this empire of liberty being created. Now this one, and let me move this over so I can actually read everything I have here. We should have such an empire of liberty as has never surveyed since the creation. That's also Jefferson. But he said it about 20 years later when he was talking about spreading across the continent and adding the Louisiana Purchase. So that idea of empire, that idea of expansion, it's in the DNA of the country, for better or for worse. And so you see that even from a president and a leader that maybe isn't as associated with that. The acquisition of Canada will be a matter of marching. So you may have already guessed that this is from the War of 1812. You may be surprised as to who said it. If people in the comments want to guess or maybe show how knowledgeable they are, you can throw it out there. David, anybody got some guesses on this particular quote? It is a little known person by the name of Thomas Jefferson. So just like the other two, this is still Thomas Jefferson, except being very aggressive here, thinking that Canada they will welcome us. They would love for us to march into their areas and claim them as the United States. Obviously, that's not how it turned out, but it does kind of show you the ideas, even from Jefferson, about expansion and just how easy it can be and how necessary for some people they thought it was. Sorry, I'm trying to move my bar again so I can see stuff. Next one, the American continents, by the free and independent condition, which they have assumed and maintain are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for colonization by any European powers. That's strong, that's bold, that's James Monroe. Hopefully more people recognize that because that's from the Monroe Doctrine. But again, it shows an element of the United States not just expanding, but expanding in its physical realm, but its realm of influence, its sphere of influence, which is a term a lot of people associate with turn of the century and in Asia and other places, but that term was used referring back even to the Monroe Doctrine. Sorry, I'm trying to bring this next part up. keep having to move people around here. All right. It will place a dense and civilized population in large tracts of country now occupied by a few savage hunters. Again, this really, to me, encapsulates a large part of what came along with expansion. There is little and has been little, if any, area of the world, other than maybe Antarctica, that is occupied by only a few people. But we liked to have thought that at certain times because it very much served our purpose. And this, of course, is Jackson discussing the Indian removal, which we were taking places, the United States was taking places that were not just occupied, but were occupied by thousands of people. And in some cases in Georgia, not just by tribal groups or by nomadic groups, but people who had houses, people who had crops, people that had adapted so much to the culture around them that several owned slaves. And so the only difference between their incoming neighbors and them being that they were not white. And so that obviously played a part in some of the expansion as well, and the ramifications of that expansion. The danger from the United States is in the settler and intrigue and conspiracy, not in their armies and navies. So as you can sense, these quotes are going in a chronological order. And so now we're moving on to Texas. And this was a statement made by a British diplomat. And it is very much a part of this topic because time and time again, as you read about American expansion, a large, very necessary part of it is good old-fashioned fertility rates. There were just record-setting fecundity among the settlers and the people moving across the continent that there was nothing the other countries and the other powers could do to this mass, to stop this mass of people as they first came in trickles and then just grew and grew and grew from there. So again, that's an important part about this topic. Another part is the fact that this is, as every part of history, but I think we need to be reminded about it, is it's not monolithic. It's not, everybody thought this. The American public supported this. There's obviously dissenting opinions. Some of them are very strong percentages. Sometimes there's multiple dissenting opinions, and sometimes the prevailing decision is not even the popular one. So it's good to note the other ways, the other perspectives that these things were viewed through. For myself, I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war as one of the most unjust, that should be ever, waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. You may have been able to guess, because these are chronological, like I said, that this is talking about the Mexican-American War. You may be surprised that this was written by Ulysses S. Grant in his memoirs. He obviously is well known for his service during the Mexican-American War, as many of the officers who played prominent roles in the Civil War, they got their start, or in some cases, a lot of seasoning in the Mexican-American War. But his opinion there shows that even though something happened, it didn't necessarily have to happen. It didn't necessarily just follow suit that, of course, the next step was this. It was a fait accompli. It's not. All of these things could have very easily changed on a dime, so to speak, with just a slightly different outcome with every individual step along the way. So I think that's a part of this topic we're going to look at. I preach to you then, my countrymen, that our country calls not for the life of ease, but for the life of strenuous endeavor. If you've read anything from section 3, you may have seen this already, the strenuous life, very famous quote from Teddy Roosevelt. The reason I put this here regarding the topic is because there is a very strong theme in power players of the late 1900s, this idea and ideal of manhood and what it means to be a man and how the country overall is softening because we haven't had a good war in a few years. And the only way to really prove oneself is through war. Now, Roosevelt applied this particular belief, I think, to a lot of things in his life, but specifically he brings it up in connection to foreign policy, in connection to service in war. And so that obviously frames his opinion about our activities as a country, whether it's going to war and what we do while we are engaged in a battle or a police action or a war. You know, he personally, his father opted out of service in the Civil War, and a lot of different sources claim that Roosevelt kind of wore that internally as a badge of dishonor and really sought to overcome that for his family's reputation. And that framed how he looked at the world and the US and its involvement in wars. Well, not just as an individual, that was definitely part of it, but moving on from there, how he looked at the US's involvement and just people's involvement in war. It was not to be shied away from in his mind. Another part in this, of course, is from section 3 as well. Rudyard Kipling brought us a lot of different things that I'm sure you've heard of, in Jungle Book obviously being one of the most famous, but The White Man's Burden is right up there as far as what he's known for. And he literally wrote this specifically in support of the United States effort in the Spanish-American War and that expansion of taking over these territories and these people that he, and of course he was not alone, and Roosevelt and Taft and others saw as uncivilized and unable to govern themselves. And so you really can't underestimate the importance that world outlook has in taking over a country, for one, and then what you do with the people inside that country once you get there. It's very much a part of how we operated, for better or for worse, obviously. To get involved, Teddy Roosevelt always felt that we should. How we treat the people that we're involved with, some people's ideas of their level of civilization was certainly not the most refined stance in the world. As you can see, Josiah Strong, quote here, "This race is destined to dispossess many weaker ones, assimilate others, and mold the remainder until it has Anglo-Saxonized mankind." That was not something that people kind of discussed or maybe held in the background that they wanted to do. It was out and out. This is why we should do this, because this is the best way to do things in their opinion. And so everyone is going to be better for it if they can be Anglo-Saxonized, whether they believe it or not. And then finally, getting to the last element of this topic, this is Wilson. "We are citizens of the world. The tragedy of our times is that we do not know this." And of course, you can tell by his actions, World War I being the most obvious, but his dozens and dozens of interventions during his terms, and of course, he wasn't the only one, but certainly it kind of reaches a height there, into Latin America and into countries within the US sphere of influence at that time, shows that he definitely believed it was on the US to do this, and that the US knew best how to do it and was the only one with the power to do it. And if they didn't, dominoes would fall, so on and so forth. And his idea of throwing away what had been seen as a staple of America, which is isolationism from the previous century, is kind of encapsulated right here. And basically since then, isolation has been discussed, but not really practiced in the US for several reasons, some better than others, so to speak, but it definitely shows the other element of this topic, which is intervention. The map here kind of shows these different areas of intervention, why we were involved. And so what am I going to ask about in this topic? Well, I'm going to see what happened through this picture of how the U.S. became the U.S., what could have been, and who and what made that decision. Who or why did they decide, yes, this needs to be included, no, that doesn't? For example, Dominican Republic, right there, we were definitely involved. We definitely made it a protectorate for, 3+ decades, but we almost made it a actual part of the United States, an actual territory. Grant specifically wanted to do that. The Dominican Republic offered itself up and said, hey, you guys should come take us and add us in, incorporate us, but it wasn't. And so why not? And obviously one of the reasons is going to be racial issues, the composition of the country. You had a lot of aggressive actions to forestall any expansion that would have brought in other races at that time. Just its next door neighbor, Haiti, kind of tells you everything you need to know. After Spain started to lose its empire and everyone in Latin America started to declare its independence from Spain, the United States was right on it, identifying and recognizing these breakaway rebellious governments as independent. Just didn't take time at all. Haiti became independent, in the first few years of the 1800s, yet it took the United States over 60 years to recognize it as independent. And so, those kind of considerations came into play, certainly. And that's part of why we expanded in some places and why we didn't in others, why we added some territories and why we added others that became states. So that's what I want to look at. Why did it happen? What else could have happened? Why wasn't Cuba added as a territory, but the Philippines were? There's a lot of information about that, which obviously is better known than some of the other areas, but still just as important and just as interesting to look at. Why was Puerto Rico taken in, but Cuba wasn't? So we'll be looking at that in the topic. Imperialism is probably going to get the most play. And when I say imperialism, again, it's kind of thematic. You could call this whole thing imperialism. You could call this whole thing expansion. You could call this whole thing intervention. Some just more dramatic than others. But in the traditional sense, at least as I'm familiar with it, imperialism generally refers to the end of the 19th century. And so that's going to get the most play because the book is there, for one. For another, if you look at the Section 3 documents, it's heavily represented and in the terms, though not as heavily in the terms as some other things. So I would say that's probably going to get the most play. Expansion, which in my definition is just the movement of the United States from east to west and taking over those territories or buying those territories or dispossessing the people of those territories. That is probably going to get the next most. And I think you can see that in the terms already. And then intervention would be significant, but have the least play in the tests as far as numbers of questions compared to the other two. Don't know specifics on that, like percentages, but that's my thinking going in. Even though intervention, as this map shows you, has numerous events that can be talked about. Events with significant expansion-related events within them, so multiple things happen because of them, those are going to get a lot of time. Those are going to get a lot of play. So wars and their treaties, although sometimes it's just a treaty. We didn't just have treaties because of wars. A lot of what happened concerning expansion was settled by treaty, thankfully, without war. So those type of things that added a lot of territory or changed the control of a lot of territory, they'll get certainly a lot of play. Presidencies. So the main ones, you're going to have Polk for sure, TR and McKinley, obviously, and Wilson. When I just think of the top ones that align with these certain periods, but definitely Jefferson as well. You got to look at, as I said, I had several quotes there where it's not just, oh, I got the Louisiana Purchase because it was a deal that I couldn't pass up. It's like a 2-for-1 Snickers in the checkout aisle. Louisiana Purchase was just going, and I had to grab it at that price. He obviously saw that as a part of a greater movement in the United States towards expansion. So those presidencies that saw a lot of action in this topic will get a lot of coverage. And then movements for or against those expansions, obviously the anti-slavery movement and the free soil movement are going to be a big part of it. Anti-imperialism gets a lot of coverage in the book and is covered in the terms and parts of Section 3 as well. So that's a movement that'll get some coverage. And then obviously the ramifications of those events, what happened when we added this territory, whether it be, what happened after we added Texas. That one's pretty obvious with the Mexican-American War setting the stage for that. What happened just when Kansas and Nebraska were organized, obviously turning into, bleeding Kansas. So those are kind of some examples of things that will be looked at, the ramifications of adding territory, of our interventions or our expansions or our actions under imperialism. What were the ramifications from that? All right, 3-2-1 approach. This is where I talk about how is it best to study this, in my opinion. Obviously, you don't have to follow this approach, but I find it very useful. You go finite to infinite, which is unfortunately what the terms tend to feel like, is that they're never ending. They just go on and on and on. So start with the thing you can wrap your head around and your students can wrap their minds around most easily, which is Section 3. It's a list of documents. None of the documents are that long, and that list, going over them and reading them, there's only so much information to be had. Who said it? When did they say it? When did they say it? Why did they say it? So right there, you can kind of really get a sense of, I've got a good idea of what Section 3 is in a relatively short amount of time. It's not incorporating so many abstract and new and foreign ideas. Once you do that, it will naturally build a base, a foundation for your students to then look at the next element in the topic, which to me is Section 2. It's the book, which obviously gets much more specific, but now that they have a foundation, those specifics won't seem as overwhelming when they read the book. And obviously with this year's book, we're talking about the Spanish-American War and then moving it into the Philippine-American War and the U.S.'s actions and political fallout from those events. So once they do that, now they have all these documents about various aspects of U.S. expansion. They have a lot of specifics about Spanish-American War in the Philippines. When they get to Section 1, which I would do last, a lot of those terms they already at least have a passing knowledge of. A lot of those people, they've at least heard their basic association with this country or that era. And so it's not as daunting. It doesn't seem as infinite as it does if you just try to dive into Section 1 first. And like I said, the math doesn't lie on that. Section 3.
Andy, we have a question.
Okay.
From the previous slide, actually, from Robert. He says, can we assume both sides of the transactions to add territory will be covered? Example, Napoleon wanting to cut his losses in the Americas and money to take over Europe.
100%. 100%. Because without that, it doesn't happen. So we'd have to look at that. It kind of goes back to what I said originally. When we look at U.S. history, a lot of it involves international relations. Because it has to. We can't look at it in a vacuum, otherwise we really wouldn't understand it. It's sometimes half the story or less than half the story. So yes, very good question, and the answer is 100%. So jumping back to this, the documents, 10 questions per, there's only 50 questions total I'm going to write on these documents, and each one's worth 3 points. So every bit of information you get, and again, the pool of information you're pulling from is smaller, it's worth 3 points on that test. So just, from a very mercenary standpoint, it helps you out. I'd rather look at it from an educational standpoint, which is I think it's easier for students and even teachers to learn that way, to go from the general and the broad down to the specifics. I used to compare it with my kids, like, we're going to cover the skeleton of this topic first. You're going to know the general shape of it. And by the end, you'll know every single mole and hair and scar. But if we start with those tiny little details, it's too much. Until we know the basic structure, it'll be hard to even remember those details. But as you get that foundation going, the details stick more and more because they have something to stick to. Okay? Section 1, like I said, in the past, I hit this last. Especially when sections 2 and 3 overlap, which they do to a certain extent this year. I like to say you should make flashcards on these very basic ones early before you move on and start practicing them. Practice once you get past section 3 and section 2, but you can create the cards at the very beginning. And as you study section 3 and section 2, you go back and you add, oh, this is important. I didn't put this in. And this is important. I need to add this about this person or this term into your card so that they're more useful when you finally get to the studying stage. Okay. So terms related questions, again, there's a lot out there. People, and I mentioned this because somebody asked about it in the previous one, and I always talk about it here, but I already alluded to it before because someone brought up the question of the weight I give them. I do give the people twice as much weight as the actual terms. I know I'm running long because I've talked forever, so I'm not going to go to the list, but the link right here goes to the actual list. And so what I'm talking about with weighting more is I don't do this. This is something from way back there when Larry was still doing the topic. He actually broke down World War I. He's like 3 to 7 terms here and probably about 5 terms here. And then this area is going to have this. I don't do that. I don't have it itemized and percentage out like that. What I have is that I randomize it. So say there's 300 terms. There's 300 numbers. I pick 20 for a test. I put in the randomizer. It gives me 20 numbers, 1 through 300, except for the fact that the people actually get 2 numbers. So it's more like I'm dealing with, 400 numbers that get put in. And so a person is twice as likely as a term to show up. Then again, they may be used in a group. People and major events, just because they're in section or set A does not mean they won't show up at district or state. They could be theoretically a different aspect of a person's or an event's information could be covered in every single test. So don't get fooled that, oh, we don't need to learn anything else about this because he already asked that question. But people and events are definitely the best chances for repeats. Terms just straight up like this term means this. Can't think of one right now, but let's say oxen. Oxen probably won't show up more than once. If you know what oxen is on one test, there's not a whole lot I can throw in there in addition to that term to justify an extra question. All right, continuing on section 1, what kind of questions will I ask? It'll be these type of things about people. Where are they from? What places or groups are they associated with? Their background, the positions that they held, unique qualities. They were the first person to hold this position, the last person, the only American to visit this area, or the first American to do this. And certainly alternative names, which aren't as frequent as say last year. There's a lot of alternative names. There still are, and they're just nicknames and titles that people have, and those are definitely ripe for questions. Chronology, give you 4 events, tell you to put them in order, but also cause and effect relationships. What was the main reason or main event preceding this? And so obviously, if the more you know about chronology, the better. Events, it's very basic. Who was involved? Where did it take place? When did it take place? And when's usually not a year, but in relation to other events. And then as always, and I mentioned this before in the previous session, first, last, things that are very unique about people or events.
Andy, we have a comment or question about Quizlet and the terms.
So Quizlet is something I definitely recommend using because you can't lose Quizlet. You can make 400 note cards that are just beautiful and have all the information you need on 3x5 index cards, and then they're gone. And that is a tragedy. So Quizlet is obviously the best, especially if you have multiple people on your team and say, hey, you make these, you make these, you make these, but they're all appearing in the same deck in real time. And then also you can, let's say, borrow someone else's deck, because other people have, already done this and they may have published it. And also a lot of these terms overlap with certain parts of US history or AP history. And so people may have made Quizlet decks just to help them study that. Take those. They're already made. Borrow them and send them a nice note and say, thank you so much for doing this for me. But yes, I highly recommend Quizlet, not just for the sharing features, but for the permanence of digital versions. And then also the fact that a lot of it's going to be out there for you to at least get started. So section 2 questions about the book, obviously. What types of questions will you see? This slide was in the previous presentation and basically just talks about the book and why I chose the book, which I've referred to a little bit in this session already, so I won't spend all my time on it. But I do like the fact that it's basically chronological. It does back and forth a little bit within months or within a year to talk about different aspects, but it is pretty chronological, so it makes it easier to study, and there could definitely be questions on that. Section 3, these are related to the documents. So one thing I wanted to throw out there was that the biggest section, if you looked at section 3, you notice the other writings or the primary sources is the largest section as far as number of items in it. But it's also the shortest as far as the length of most of the documents within it. So it is the most likely to be used in combination, where a couple different sources, a couple different documents from it are used within a question. So that's something I definitely wanted people to know about. The questions that you'll see on section 3, it's going to be context, obviously, is a big part, because I don't want it to be just throw a phrase up there and tell me what it came from. If it's a very important quote, yes, expect those questions to happen. They will, where I will have a quote out there and it will require the student to know what document that came from. But it's going to be a very significant, like, you should know, if you don't know that this quote came from this document, you don't know that document. But also there'll be questions on the context, the who, the what, the where, the why of why it was written, or why it was passed, or why the treaty was created, or why the speech was made, or what that speech led to. And then, of course, Supreme Court cases, the issues involved, generally the constitutional issues, which amendment it might have dealt with, or which issue was most pressing, what the decision determined, and some significant individuals involved. And by significant, it could be historically, or it could be the individual who brought the case, information about them and their background and why they brought the case. Other areas,
Yep. Andy, we have a question about the links on the paper with the terms on it.
Uh-huh.
The links where we can find the supplemental reading materials are the links on that paper with supplemental reading materials.
Yes, they're on and I have that later on in the presentation. They have, when you go to the UIL website and you look at the terms list, once you get past the documents, that list of links is where you're going to find most of these. A lot of times, if you just Google the name and the year and the person who did it, all that information that you see on the UIL list, you'll have several different options on the internet that you can find. But I went ahead and I listed several because I thought that might be a little helpful to people to find sources that I am definitely going to look at when I write that question. Because section 3 is very much like section 1. Each document will get a number, and I could weight some of them more, but I haven't really thought that I will yet. But every document is going to get a number, and I'll just randomize. And for each test, I will pick 10 numbers and write a question about that document. And so I will go to these websites that I've listed, and I'll look at them. And so that's what I want other people to do as well, is to go and see exactly what I'm looking at as well. All right, so that's, again, some of what I'll be asking about for section 3. We talked about those before. And of course, these could be from any question, any section. Those are the type of questions that I'll ask. Cause and effects, exceptional situations. I've talked about that. Essay areas, I talked about this in the previous one. These are different essay topics from the book. So, just look at that when you have time, go back and see what these are. Throughout the year, I'll go back to this slide and to my next couple slides when I'm trying to decide what the essay is going to be. So there is a good chance that it's on here, though it's not 100%, that the essays you see, the 5 essays, will be from here. There might be one that I decide on and I find out, this is really interesting. I can't believe I didn't put that in the slide. I think I have to cover it as an essay. But there's about I would say a 90% chance that if it's an essay, it was on this slide or this slide or the next one that I have. And again, this is just, I know I'm running long, so I'm trying to push through, but these, you can go back and see. I won't explain why each of them is there. I think most of them are self-explanatory, but why they could be essay topics. Okay. And that's kind of let me go back here really quick. Again, if a term overlaps with the book, section 2, and a document or multiple documents in section 3, it is a really good, there's a really good chance that it could be an essay. Certainly that it could be a question, obviously, because it's going to, even randomize, it's going to have more weight than others, but an even better question or chance that it could be an essay question. These are just general guidelines for what to look for the essay, which I talked about before, and I'll talk about more next week on Friday, not Thursday, when we have the essay discussion. Okay. Here's the thing. As I said before, just use common sense. Let your intelligence that I know you all have be your guide. If you see it and it seems important, and then you see it again, and then you see it again, then yes, it is important. Okay. Important note here, and this is the last thing that I really wanted to get in, is everything, all these links that we just talked about, and within this PowerPoint, this takes you right to that page where the links are listed after the section 3 documents. That is not the be all end all. One of the biggest aspects about social studies and learning and the educational process of social studies and involved with it is research. And I don't want to just throw out a list of facts or a list of people and where I find the facts about them and people just memorize. I mean, a perfect example is the spelling contest in UIL. If you're familiar with it, there's a list of the vocab, there's a list of the spelling words, but on every single test, there's a percentage of outside words that could be from anywhere. And they just are a test of your innate spelling ability. And with social studies, I don't want it to be a test of your innate social studies ability. I do want it to have some element of how you research and how you go about learning a topic. Is it just what's listed in black and white, or is it more holistic and learning about the theme that this topic encompasses? With that being said, 99.9% of these questions are going to come from the links provided. But I do think it's important that we're not spoon feeding this. And then it's also important that, everything I listed, it's very finite. And so I may not have enough information within those sources to really come up with what I feel is a quality question. So I have to go other places. If I do, and I find something that's great, it'll be tweeted. I will put it out there. I'm not going to hide it. I want people to be able to research. I want people to be able to learn. To that point, YouTube is a great source for information. I'm probably not going to use it as specifically a source for a question, but when you're talking about learning, those little 5-minute histories of this or 10-minute histories of this, not only are they entertaining, and they're some of them are pretty hilarious, but it's a way to build that foundation to get the kids the base they need to start to assimilate more specific facts. And Wikipedia is not a bad thing. Wikipedia is a great thing. It's an amazing thing. You just got to make sure that it's sourced. And generally some of these topics that you're talking about, those articles could be written by grad students. They could be written by people who have a lot of knowledge of it. But if you're unsure, always check the source pages or check the footnotes. And then you can follow up and say, okay, you know what, this does seem to actually be 100% something that is either verifiable or at least, reliable. And all this other stuff is basically just like some team building and, different ideas of what you can do, which for the more advanced people, you guys pretty much already know that. But if you don't, I'm just going to click through them. So you'll have the ability to see them in the recording. These are all tried and true. I mentioned most, if not all, in the previous session. So I am going to click through them here just so, again, you can refer back to them if you watch this, or if you are watching this, hello, in a recording. But that way you'll have all that information. And that's all I got.
Great.
All being a relative term. I know I spent over an hour talking. But...
Thanks, Andy. No specific questions at this point. There may be some that pop up. I'm just going to cover some things that were generally posted earlier. One question was just, how do we encourage reading for students who feel they know enough just to wing it? One suggestion, one comment in the comment chat was just give them the invitational practice test. Do you have anything else you want to add to that, Andy?
Yeah, they don't know enough information to wing it. I don't know enough information to wing it, and I'm writing this test. Like, if you can impress anything on them, it's just the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. But that suggestion of giving them a practice test, yeah, that's the best way to do it, because let's face it, a lot of people, experience is the only teacher that they trust, unfortunately. So you could tell them until you're blue in the face, until they see it or they experience the fact that they don't really know everything. That's what it's going to take. So I say go for it. Practice tests are the best.
Couple of comments about just books as you're reading them. Someone commented what Half God Wrought is well written, but it takes a lot of time to read, but has a really good explanation of the antebellum South.
Yeah, it's really, really well written. So if you've got time, which some people during this whole situation have a little bit more than they did before, yeah, it's a good book. It is thick, so it'll also double as a paperweight. But if you want to read it, I definitely recommend it. Some of those others are more specific to this topic. So as far as if you're prioritizing, I wouldn't put it as high. But as far as enjoyability and just understanding U.S. history overall, it's unquestionably great.
And there was another recommendation for American Caesar about Douglas MacArthur. Early chapters about Arthur MacArthur are really concise and effective.
Oh yeah, that's a great recommendation as well, because Arthur MacArthur comes up a lot in the book. Sorry, I was going back to the books here. Comes up a lot in this year's primary reading source, Honor in the Dust. So yeah, that's great. I hadn't thought about that, but 100% I would recommend that as well.
Question about, will there be questions with maps?
That's interesting. There could be. How about that? I don't want to rule it out. To be honest, they're difficult to do because you have to, obviously use a source that's open source for that map, no copyright issues. But if there was ever a topic that called for it, this is it. But then also, you get into printing quality sometimes, and I don't want there to be any distractions from it. But if I find a way to do it where I'm completely confident in it, then yeah, I would love to use some maps. I would love to use this map right here. It's just my favorite map in just the last 5 minutes. So I'm just going to stare at this while you give me any other questions you got.
Richard asked, will Theodore Roosevelt be an essay question?
Okay, so I'm obviously not going to say 100% on that. But I mean, I respect the question. The chances of Theodore Roosevelt in some way being involved in an essay are extremely high. Now, with that being said, watch it just work out and I don't ask one about him. But standing here right now, I'm hard pressed to find someone that jumps to mind that would be easier to write an essay question related to this topic about. There's some that are right up there with him, but it's hard to find someone above him.
In the last session, you mentioned students must write objective responses in capital letters. If they forget, will they be disqualified from the contest?
I didn't mention that. It's on the document, the answer document, which I've thought of actually changing, because I don't want anyone to be disqualified for that. You know, it's the suggestion is there because that's the easiest to read for most people and the easiest to tell the difference. But no, in my mind, they shouldn't be. And honestly, that's a good point, that I should just change the answer sheet, because that's been on there for a long time. It should be suggested, and it's suggested for a good reason. But I would hate for someone to put in the effort to show up, to answer those questions, and then just because of that, not be graded.
Francis asks, should we have the student read for the argument or for contest?
Say that again?
Should we have the student read for the argument or for contest?
Are we talking about for section 3, like on court cases?
That doesn't clarify. Francis, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask in person.
It's actually supposed to be, let me see if I can get it going. Are we going to have them read for the argument of the book or the article, or are we going to have them read for the content?
Okay.
I swapped the N and S.
That's okay. That's a good question. And the answer is both. Because like I said, the content as far as specific, I will very much look at using a quote, a specific quote in content for questions. But at the same time, you know, there is a high probability there will be a question that says, which of the following documents argued for this, or suggested this, or was in support of this. So both. Good question. And very quickly, to go back to what Richard said before about Teddy Roosevelt, just to reemphasize, again, if someone shows up in section 1, 2, and 3, then that's a very high chance that they'll be covered in an essay. There are some that will show up in all 3 that won't, but he's a perfect example of someone who's obviously prominently featured in the book, has a document and documents about them in section 3, and is a term, and is involved with other terms in section 1.
Very good. A lot of good, people are asking a lot of questions. People are giving lots of good feedback. Here's one was about any YouTube videos that would help out that you'd recommend.
You know, I'll post those on Twitter, because I haven't, I looked at a few very early on, whereas with the Asia topic, there were some that I was like, oh, these are amazing. These are so great. And I shared them instantly. But yeah, I'm writing that down right now, that I'll go look for some specifically that I think are good.
Authors, Spanish-American War.
Are they asking
the author question mark, Spanish-American War?
Oh, that book. You know what? I don't have that with me. I know exactly what they're talking about. They're talking about the student guide to the Spanish-American War. Go ahead and ask me another question if you have one, and I'll look.
We got a lot of comments about your animated map, and they want to know what the source is.
So I made that. No, I didn't. I would love, if I could make maps like that, that's all I would do. And I wouldn't sell them or anything. I would just make them to look at. I have that at home on my home computer.
Williams now put the link up in the comment chat section for us.
Oh, found it?
I believe so.
Okay, great.
Somebody would like for you at some point to go back to the essay slide with your essay ideas. However, if you will send this to Glenda or I, we'll get this whole thing posted on this website if you want us to.
Yes, which I'll do as soon as we're done here, but while we're talking, at least in these last few minutes, I can put up the essay ideas.
So everyone, if you will go to that Capital Conference online page, probably later on this afternoon or certainly by tomorrow, we'll have both of Andy's presentations up there. And we're just getting them up as people get them to us, so that should grow throughout the summer as well. We have a question about Huey Long, question mark.
You know, I actually studied about Huey Long when I got my master's, and love to read about him. I've read about half a dozen books on him specifically, but you know, I had to draw the line somewhere, and so he did not make the cut. But going back quickly to that Spanish-American War book, it's not an author because it's a series, but it's By Captivating History. By Captivating History is the series that Spanish-American War book comes from.
How did you ultimately pick your 3-point documents?
I came up with like 100 because they were all so good to me. But what I wanted to do was try to give a little more context. I know in the past we've done a lot of Supreme Court cases, we've done legislation, we've done treaties, and a few speeches, especially with civil rights, we added more speeches, but we didn't have a lot of primary source documents, letters, and articles from the era, from the average person, which I think really gives you a different and informative perspective on the topic. And so that's why I went through and added some of those. As far as what made the cut and what didn't, I wanted to try and cover as many areas as possible. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure the things that I thought were really important were covered in depth. So there's a lot that I tried to include there, but I really felt bad having to cut some of them out, but I know I didn't want to overwhelm people. Like I said in the previous session, we had an entire topic on Native Americans, and I could have listed 20, 30 documents that just dealt with Native American and US expansion relations and processes. But because that topic did exist, I wanted to include parts of it, but also go over other areas. So that's why I tried to draw the line while at the same time being as expensive, no pun intended, as possible.
Do the 3-point documents group around different eras, and would it help to study the eras organized by people, terms, and documents?
I think so. I don't see any downside to that. Because again, there's going to be themes that connect them. And so after you do that and have established that, I think you'll find it necessary to say, you know what, we also need to group these in a different way. But to me, that's a great way to start. And like I said, you may eventually see, you know what, all of these people, even though they're from different eras, need to be included in this particular designation, whether it be, an obvious one would be filibusters or, secretaries of state or, adventurers. Even though they're from different eras, they should be studied together as well. But I don't think you need to start there. I think chronologically just makes the most sense to people. So why not use it?
Anything about yellow journalism, Hearst, etc.?
Oh, yeah. Hearst covered a lot or not a lot. Hearst and Pulitzer are covered in the book in section 2. So you got to know about them. If you read the War Lovers, they're talked about there a lot because they do play a significant role in what happened and what did not happen. I mean, they, more than most politicians of the era, formed the U.S. reaction. Maybe not policy, in some ways they did, but definitely the reaction. And so definitely know about them. They're in the book. They're in section 1 as terms, but I don't recall putting anything, although I almost did. I almost put some actual articles in section 3. So yes, they play a prominent role, but I don't believe I included any in section 3.
Great. And that was, we just need to open up a chat box and let people chat, because Angela's exact response was Hearst and Pulitzer are in the book. So there you go. And somebody wants to know, remind them of your Twitter handle again.
At Mr. Academics.
Very
Mr.
good.
Academics.
Well, it looks like we have all of our questions answered, and you've now used all our bandwidth server space we have on the UL website for us to post this. So
That was my goal. I wanted
Cool.
to, press those limits.
I want to thank everyone for sticking around and all of your interest in all you do. It's been so great so far. We'll see you next Friday at 11 a.m. for the, that's Friday the 26th, for the Social Studies and Current Issues and Events essay session. Thanks for everyone logging in. We'll have these PowerPoints posted on our online page for Capital Conference. And don't hesitate to get in touch if you need something.